1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, inspired by a theological idea, a papal bull, a statement from the Pope that said that the world could be conquered in order to be Christianized. Theological ideas matter because that led the driving force of manifest destiny, of a particular group of people with the conviction that they had the right to prance all over the world and take your wallet and call it their own. So as we mark and remember the ways in which the peoples who have inhabited this land the longest were out of that theological idea made subjects. We also wrestle with the fact that those same folks and their descendants sit at our border today, being told that they do not have the right to participate in an increasingly global society. And it matters that we be mindful of that because those same theological ideas that can drive, and theological means big picture, having to do with whatever you want to call God. So bigger than the particular concerns we have, large enough to encompass the world. Many of those folks sitting on the border today hold one of two possibilities. They are either a threat that calls for a national security crisis, or they hold with them the American dream. The conviction that in this land there is a brighter future and possibility yet to come, rather than fear that our best years are behind and we must make the country great again in the way it was at some point. So that is a competing narrative, a different theological perspective on what's happening. And many of those folks on our border carry with them ancient stories, because that is the way that many of the people that inhabited these lands first, and many of our communities of color, many of those who were forced to be moved across oceans, they carry wisdom not in books, but in narratives and stories. Some of those find their ways into books, and they can compete with the brightest whatever measures we're going to have in higher education around it. But more importantly, they carry with them individual stories that speak to the particular and from there to the universal. So how do we engage these great ideas? John F. Kennedy, when he was president, posited one of these big ideas. That's not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. If you go to seminary, I'm at Pacific School of Religion. It's a seminary. We teach funky things like what it's called a chiastic structure, which is what this is. You get a word, it gets repeated, you go backwards through it, right? So country gets repeated, it has an X form to it. It's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. This call led to what at Pacific School of Religion in the 60s, we are in Berkeley, after all, so the center of much of the changes and the leading of change from educational institutions about social change. It led to a program that was called at that time The New Breed. This was the admissions brochure for PSR, Pacific School of Religion, in the 60s. The conviction that there was a need at that moment for a very different type of leadership in the society. The leadership that we saw inspired and continue to canonize, in a way, in leaders like Martin Luther King, like Rabbi Heschel, like Jesse James, like many others. We are seeing seeds and evidence of the fact that we are at a time, again, where a new breed, we won't use that language, it's very problematic today, but we recognize that there is a need for a different way of thinking about leadership. Leadership that can reach across various sectors, that can draw on the wisdoms of our communities, that has integrity. The statement from Kennedy is also printed, no preguntes qué puedes hacer tú por tu país, o tu país por ti, pregunta qué puedes hacer tú por tu país. This very poor translation of Kennedy's words are on a mural on an abandoned Walmart that has been converted on our US-Mexico border to be the holding place for 1,500 unaccompanied children. Think about the power of narratives, of theologies. To take this statement and put it on the wall of a group where you are holding a group of children whose countries have failed to protect and create opportunities to them, and who are being held by another country that has failed them and incarcerated them rather than seek to provide them the liberty that they need that is in our best interest. And to tell them that they should think about what they can do for the country rather than demand what the country can do for them is at best Orwellian. It is horrendous. But it is an indication of the crisis we have of leadership and the need for new ways of thinking. We are facing a massive change in the United States. The challenges that higher education is facing, it is crumbling in some ways. Our buildings are in some places. But it needs to. It needs to change in order to reflect the forms of wisdoms and changes that are happening across the spectrum. Now, that change can be overwhelming, and so the kind of leadership that is needed to this time of change has to be different. In a book called Thank You for Being Late by Thomas Friedman, I invite you to take a look at the book. You can watch it online on YouTube, his presentation on it. I don't agree with everything with Thomas Friedman. In fact, I disagree with him on a lot. But I do like many of the statements on this book. His basic idea, the subtitle of the book is An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Acceleration. He argues that we are living through a time of acceleration of many things that are changing very rapidly. He focuses on globalization, environmental degradation, and on changes that are happening in technology. That they are duplicating, based on Moore's law, every 18 months technology duplicates and doubles. This has been happening since the 40s. That means that today, 10 years after the development of the iPhone, right? This thing controls our life in more ways than we can imagine. What Friedman argues is that the world is changing so rapidly, while humans' capacity to adapt is more linear. So you see that gap between the change and our ability to adapt. This new breed, this new form of leadership needs to step into that gap. The kind of leadership at Pacific School of Religion that we are exploring is the idea of fusion leadership. Fusion leadership, let's go to a little science very quickly. To make fusion happen, atoms of hydrogen must be heated to very high temperature. I think we got some high temperature going on in this society, wouldn't you say? So we got that element. So they are ionized, forming a plasma, and have sufficient energy to fuse. Earlier today, we heard the fact that many of our leaders for change are burning up because they do not have sufficient energy to restore themselves, to draw from a deep enough well. So we need sufficient energy and then be held together, confined long enough for fusion to occur. So you need these three things. You need high temperature, you need sufficient energy, and you need to be held together long enough. Without it, the fusion just blows up if you are not held together. The kind of leadership I think we need is fusion leadership that has the ability to think in big picture. We'll call it theological education. Let's call it whatever you like that works for you. But to me, it's about big picture, to place the things we care deeply about in a large enough framework. Our ancient communities have been working on this for a very long time to deal with massive change in society. So we need the capacity to think in big thoughts. We need education to shape us as deep thinkers, not just people who act, but who think. We need sufficient energy to have a deep enough well to draw from so we don't burn up and so that our communities don't burn up. What are the rituals, the practices, the spiritual things that help us to sustain ourselves, and how do we develop the capacity to do this for others? That has been critical to any social movement, as we heard the explanation and definition of it today. And finally, we need to be held together long enough. One of the hardest things we are facing is the isolation of individuals. Now, religious communities have played the role of bringing people together, sometimes in very isolated and segregated ways. So I'm not talking about, some placid understanding of religion as the solution of all things. But what are the ways in which we come together? and are held together long enough so that this high energy, high temperature can be held with sufficient energy to bring about change, not the fusing of things into some amalgamated homogeneous idea of everybody looks the same and we all melt into some pot. Rather, the releasing of the energy that is within us, within each of us, which is what our ancient ones have known and explored and pondered and been in awe of. As part of theological education, this weird work we do in preparing both leaders for religious communities and for social change who are spiritually rooted change makers. PSR is the only seminary in the Ashoka network, and we are by far the tiniest of institutions. But one of the things that we do with our students is that they spend a period of time as chaplains, either in a social movement or in a hospital. So let me conclude with this as the explanation of what I think fusion leadership is about. When I did my own clinical pastoral education, this period when you spend the time as a chaplain, I had to wear a collar, which made me a little uncomfortable. But the reason was, in the hospital they said, when there is a crisis, we need to know who's there and why. So everybody has a uniform. Everybody has a purpose. And when there is an emergency in the hospital, we need to know why you're there. But the chaplain is there not with a very defined purpose, but to mind the gaps. They're not there to measure pulse or to do this or that, but to watch for the child who's being left behind, to be mindful of how the person being impacted by this crisis is doing. Fusion leadership is about minding the gap. The gap that is happening between our adaptability for change and the gaps that are happening in the cross-sectoral divisions that we are seeing in our society. We need leaders who can be prepared to lead within communities that bring together all the sectors of our society: private, government, not-for-profit, education. That's the kind of leadership theological education has historically done that we are rethinking into fusion leadership. Critically for the things that need to be changed, but appreciatively for what it can offer. Thank you.